Hey everyone, it's Professor Clark, and in this lecture we are going to get in more detail with these complex constructions with to, and what we're going to look at are some time constructions and some other ways to use to kak or to with verbs and with prepositions. So in Russian, you cannot use a preposition with a verb. You have to have something between the preposition and the verb to take the case of the preposition, and that's normally to. So that is what we're going to look at in this lecture today. You will already know most of these prepositions, but you have used them mainly with space, but they can also be used with time. So let's go through them, starting with do. Do means before, anytime or anywhere before, in both space and time. And when we use it with a noun denoting an activity, it means at some point before that activity. So for instance, do ужина means at some point or any point before supper, do занятия at some point or any point before class. Перед is similar in that it means before in both space and time, but it means right in front of or just before. So do is sort of anywhere in front of or before something. Перед is right in front of or just before something. And similarly, as with do, we can use it with a noun that denotes an activity to mean before that activity. For instance, перед ужином is before supper, перед занятием is before class. После is a preposition that is almost only used to denote time, and we use it with the genitive to mean after. So if you use после plus some noun in the genitive, it means after that activity. So после ужина is after supper, после занятия, after class. If we are using nouns plus these prepositions, it's pretty straightforward. But what if we want to use a verb? Verbs can't decline, they can only conjugate, so we have to have something that will take the case of the preposition. And we have to separate the verb from the preposition and put it in a different clause and give the preposition something that will take its case. And we normally do that by using the construction to kak. For example, if we want to use do plus a verb, we use do того как plus the verb, meaning at some point before doing something. And we can use it with a conjugated verb or the infinitive. For instance, we could say до того как я вышла из дому, я позвонила маме. At some point before I left the house, I called my mother. We can do a similar thing with перед, only because перед takes the instrumental. Instead of того как, we have тем как. So перед тем как also means before doing something, but with the meaning of immediately before or directly before or right before. And it can only be used with the verb in the infinitive. So до того как can be used either way, but перед тем как can only be used with the verb in the infinitive. So перед тем как выйти из дому, я позвонила маме. Means right before I left the house or right before leaving the house, I called my mother. And we can do the same thing with после того как. It's exactly the same construction as до того как, but we use it to mean that something has happened after the action of the verb. And it is used with the conjugated form of the verb, always. For instance, после того как я вышла из дому, я позвонила маме. Meaning after I left the house or after leaving the house, I called my mother. Finally, we have вместо того, чтобы. This is a little different because we have чтобы instead of что or как, but it's the same basic construction where we want to use a preposition with a verb, but we can't do that, so we need something to separate them and something to take the case of the preposition. So when we use the construction вместо того, чтобы plus the infinitive of a verb, it means instead of doing something. For instance, вместо того, чтобы заниматься в библиотеке, мы смотрели телевизор. Instead of studying in the library, we were watching TV. Or вместо того, чтобы приготовить ужин дома, давай пойдем в ресторан. Instead of making supper at home, let's go out and eat. And вместо того, чтобы is always going to take the infinitive of the verb, and it could have either a perfective or an imperfective verb. And then the second clause can be past tense, future tense, kind of whatever you like or whatever you need there. Perfective, imperfective, just whatever the clause demands. It's a pretty flexible construction and a very useful construction. So there we have this basic overview of these constructions to make complex clauses, and particularly how to link verbs or actions or use a preposition with a verb to show that you're doing something instead of or before or after an action. And remember, the important thing is that you can't decline a verb. It can't take a case. So you have to have something that takes the case for it. Normally that is to, and then you can use что, чтобы, как, ли, whatever you need for the second clause. If you find this sort of confusing, the best thing to do, once again, is to do lots of reading, see examples of it in practice, and it should start to make sense and sink in. These constructions really aren't that difficult to use as long as you are comfortable with your case endings. And once you get the hang of them, they really make a lot of sense and can be picked up quite easily and used quite naturally. So we are at the end of chapter 7. That was quite a chapter. I am aware that there was a huge amount of info dumping in that chapter. Don't worry, chapter 8 will be, if anything, even more exciting because we will start on verbs of motion. So with that extremely tempting advertisement, let's say goodbye to chapter 7 and turn our attention to chapter 8.